The chandeliers of Ashcroft House burned with 1,000 steady flames, their crystal arms scattering light across damask walls and polished silver as though the evening itself wished to dazzle into obedience. Outside, winter rain stitched the darkness together, but within the dining hall, warmth reigned, measured, deliberate, aristocratic. This was the Duke of Ashcroft's domain, where order was a language spoken fluently and deviation was quietly punished. Servants glided like trained shadows, wine flowed without question, and the future was meant to be decided between courses. At the head of the table sat the Duke himself, straight-backed and immaculately composed, his presence commanding without effort. He was a man shaped by expectation, his features handsome in a way that suggested restraint rather than indulgence. Tonight, he wore the uniform of his rank as armor, for this dinner was not merely social, it was ceremonial. Beside him sat Lady Eleanor Whitcomb, his fiancée, luminous in ivory silk, her gloved hand resting lightly near his own, as if proximity alone might persuade affection to grow where calculation had planted her. Around them gathered the chosen witnesses of their alliance, titled relatives, political allies, matrons whose smiles carried the weight of judgment. Conversation drifted politely, never deep enough to trouble the surface. Laughter rose at appropriate moments, rehearsed and bloodless. Only one place at the table drew the eye for its quietness, where Miss Clara Hawthorne sat slightly apart, her posture modest, her gaze lowered. She was the governess, and thus present yet unseen, permitted only because her role required attendance, not acknowledgment. Clara had learned long ago how to make herself small. Her dark gown was plain, her hair neatly arranged, her hands folded with care. Yet invisibility offered no true protection. She felt the glances slide toward her, heard the softened voices that sharpened when they thought her beyond notice. A governess with a child and no husband was an easy subject for speculation, and society delighted in questions it pretended not to ask. She caught fragments of murmured phrases, concern disguised as courtesy, pity sharpened into suspicion. Each word pressed upon her like a thumb testing bruises. She remembered other rooms like this, other tables where she had been tolerated but never welcomed. Respectability, she had learned, was a fragile costume, easily torn by rumor. Tonight she wore it carefully, though its seams already strained. Her pulse beat in her throat as she lowered her eyes, counting breaths, willing herself into stillness. She would endure. She always had. Endurance, after all, was the only inheritance society permitted women like her. Yet beneath that practiced calm lay a history she guarded fiercely. Every polite insult scraped against memories of choices made in silence, of nights when survival required retreat rather than protest. She had believed the past settled, sealed away by time and discretion. That belief trembled now, uneasy and thin, as though the room itself sensed an approaching fracture. Even the air felt charged, humming with an anticipation she could neither name nor escape. The child beside her, however, had not learned such lessons. Little Margaret swung her legs beneath the table, her curls escaping their ribbon, her eyes bright with restless curiosity. She watched the glittering room with open wonder, unaware that every movement of hers was weighed, every breath judged. To her, this was not a battlefield of manners but a place of stories, of faces that invited trust. When her gaze found the Duke, something in her expression softened, as though recognition had stirred before reason. The Duke felt it then, the peculiar sensation of being observed not with admiration or ambition, but with simple certainty. He glanced down the table and met the child's stare. For a moment, the practiced distance in his eyes faltered. There was something unsettling in her gaze, something familiar enough to disturb him, though he dismissed the thought as fatigue. He turned back as a toast was raised, lifting his glass, sealing promises with crystal clarity. It was as the applause faded that the room shifted. Margaret slid from her chair before Clara could stop her, the small sound of shoes against marble slicing through the murmurs. Heads turned. Clara's heart stuttered, dread blooming sharp and sudden in her chest. She reached out, too late, her fingers closing on empty air as the child stepped into the open space between tables, unafraid. Margaret stopped before the Duke, craning her head to look up at him. The room held its breath. In a voice clear and untroubled, she spoke the words that would fracture the night. She did not shout. She did not hesitate. "You're my father," she said, with the calm assurance of truth. Silence fell like a physical force. A spoon slipped from a trembling hand. Lady Eleanor's smile froze, porcelain cracking beneath the strain. A murmur rippled outward, quickly smothered but impossible to erase. Clara felt the world tilt, her carefully maintained composure collapsing inward as blood roared in her ears. She rose halfway from her seat, caught between instinct and terror, every past sacrifice screaming to be remembered. The Duke did not move. Color drained from his face as something long buried stirred awake, a memory knocking with insistent dread. His gaze dropped to the child, then lifted slowly to the woman he had once known only in shadow. And in that suspended moment, before denial or scandal could speak, the truth hovered between them, waiting to be claimed. The silence did not break so much as curdle. It thickened, sour and suffocating, until even breath felt like an intrusion. Then sound returned in fragments, a chair scraping back, a startled cough, the brittle rustle of silk as Lady Eleanor's fingers tightened in her lap. Faces turned toward the child, then toward Clara, then finally toward the Duke, as if blame must be passed like an object too dangerous to hold for long. No one spoke, yet accusation bloomed everywhere, swift and merciless. Clara moved at last, her body remembering duty even as her mind reeled. She crossed the distance to Margaret and gathered her close, murmuring reassurances she did not herself believe. The child's small arms looped trustingly around her neck, unaware that her innocence had struck a match in a room soaked with powder. Clara felt eyes boring into her back, felt her name being reshaped into something sharp inside other mouths. She did not look up. If she did, she feared she might shatter. The Duke rose slowly, as though testing the weight of his own limbs. He did not reach for the child, nor did he retreat. His expression, so often composed, was unreadable now, a still surface under which currents ran deep and dangerous. He cleared his throat, but no words came. Around him, the guests recovered their voices in hushed spurts. Whispers slid along the table, urgent and delighted. Scandal was a language they spoke fluently, and tonight had offered them a feast. Lady Eleanor stood with deliberate grace. Her smile had vanished, replaced by something colder, sharper. She addressed the room with a voice that did not tremble, remarking that the child was clearly confused, that governesses were known for indulging fantasies. Laughter answered her, thin and eager. Clara flinched as if struck. Margaret protested softly, insisting upon what she knew, but her words dissolved against the collective will to disbelieve. Truth, Clara knew, was only powerful when convenient. The dinner dissolved soon after, excuses offered with excessive politeness. Cloaks were fetched, carriages summoned. Each departing guest carried away a version of the story, embroidered according to taste. By the time the last wheels rolled into the rain, reputations had already begun to rot. Clara was escorted from the hall by a senior housekeeper whose kindness was edged with caution. She was shown to her small room, where Margaret was settled into bed with promises of breakfast treats and reassurance. Only when the door closed did Clara allow herself to sink onto the chair, her strength finally spent. Sleep did not come. Memories pressed in, uninvited and vivid. She saw again a younger man, less burdened, standing beneath bare winter branches, his voice gentle, his eyes searching. She had believed that moment contained no future, only solace. She had been wrong. Down the corridor, the Duke paced his private chambers, haunted by the same recollection. He opened a drawer long untouched and withdrew a small velvet box. Inside lay a locket, dulled with age, its chain broken. He had thought it lost. Now it burned in his palm like proof. Morning brought no mercy. Newspapers arrived damp with ink and insinuation. A footman's eyes lingered too long. A maid curtsied without warmth. Clara felt the house shifting against her, walls subtly closing. She dressed Margaret and sent her to lessons with instructions not to speak of the night. The child nodded solemnly, trusting obedience would fix what honesty had broken. Alone again, Clara pressed the locket hidden beneath her bodice, the metal warm from her skin, and wondered how much longer silence could protect them. Summoned at last, she was led not to the Duke but to Lady Eleanor's sitting room. The future Duchess received her standing, her gaze assessing, calculating. She spoke of generosity, of discretion, of arrangements that could be made if Clara agreed to leave quietly. The implication was clear. Accept charity, or face ruin. Clara listened, head high, dignity scraped raw but unbroken. She refused the offered coins, the offered erasure. When she left, Lady Eleanor's composure fractured, her eyes bright with wounded pride. That afternoon, the Duke sent word. Not a command, but a request. Clara hesitated at his threshold, heart pounding, aware that whatever passed between them would redraw the boundaries of her life. Inside, he stood by the window, rain blurring the world beyond. He did not turn at once. When he did, his gaze fell not on her face, but on the locket she had unconsciously drawn into view. His breath caught, recognition flaring like a spark to tinder, and in that charged silence, the past stepped fully into the present. He waited until the door closed behind her, the latch settling with a sound too deliberate for a room already crowded with unfinished history. Firelight trembled across the shelves, gilding cracked leather spines and casting restless shadows that seemed to listen. The Duke stood near the hearth, unmoving, as though motion itself might fracture the fragile permission he had granted his own conscience. Clara remained near the threshold, hands folded, spine straight, trained composure holding back 1,000 unspoken fears. "I did not summon you to accuse," he said at last, his voice stripped of command, lowered to something almost human, "nor to shelter myself behind denial." He gestured toward a chair without sitting himself. "I wish to hear the truth, plainly, without witnesses to distort it." She crossed the room with careful steps, the hem of her gown whispering against the carpet like a warning. When she sat, she did not immediately look up. The fire crackled sharply, impatient with restraint. "The truth," she said, measured and calm, "has never been plain. It survives only where it is permitted." He inclined his head slightly, absorbing the rebuke. "Then permit it now," he replied. Silence stretched between them, taut and dangerous. Clara lifted her eyes, and in them lay no plea, only endurance honed by years of necessity. She spoke of a winter evening long past, of a conversation begun in kindness and deepened by shared solitude. She named loneliness without apology, the rare comfort of being seen without rank or expectation. "I left before morning," she said quietly. "Not from shame, but from certainty. Your future would not survive my presence." The Duke closed his eyes as memory returned whole and unmerciful. He remembered her courage then and the restraint he had mistaken for indifference. "You might have told me," he said, the words weighted with regret. "I did," she answered gently. "I told you by leaving." Her composure faltered then, only slightly, revealing the cost beneath. She spoke of discovering her pregnancy alone, of choosing silence over scandal, of working where questions were discouraged and virtue was presumed fragile. "Margaret was never a claim," she said. "She was a consequence I accepted willingly." He paced, anguish breaking through discipline. "And I lived comfortably," he said, "while you endured." The word tasted bitter. He stopped before her. "I failed you." Clara rose, startled by the rawness in his tone. "You were never asked to save me," she said steadily. "Only not to destroy us now." Their proximity tightened the air. He reached out, then stilled, his hand hovering in respect and restraint. "What do you want of me?" he asked. She studied him fully then, the man and the title bound uneasily together. "I want nothing taken," she said. "Only what is freely given. Truth. And safety for our child." The word struck him anew. He inhaled, decision settling with quiet force. Outside, the rain softened, leaving the windows streaked with light. In that pause, futures shifted unseen, and the Duke knew that silence was no longer an option, only a debt finally due. The summons was issued with a gravity that admitted no refusal. By late afternoon, Ashcroft House filled once more, not with convivial expectation but with strained curiosity. Word had spread of a statement to be made, a matter of honor requiring witnesses. Carriages arrived beneath a bruised sky, their wheels hissing on wet stone, bearing those who sensed history might tilt and wished to be present when it did. In the great hall, chairs were arranged with formal precision, though the air itself resisted order. Clara stood in a smaller adjoining room, Margaret beside her, fingers laced tightly together. The child sensed the weight of the moment, her usual chatter subdued, her gaze solemn. Clara smoothed her hair, her touch steady despite the tremor beneath. She had been offered seclusion, even escape, but she refused both. Whatever was to be decided would be decided in the open. Dignity, once stripped away, could only be reclaimed by standing where one had been judged. The Duke entered the hall last. Conversation faltered as he crossed the threshold, his presence commanding attention without flourish. He looked older somehow, the careful polish of his authority altered by something unguarded in his eyes. Lady Eleanor sat near the front, her posture immaculate, her expression composed to the point of severity. She did not rise when he approached, nor did she avert her gaze. The silence sharpened, expectant and perilous. He began without preamble. "I have called you here," he said, voice clear, "because a matter of consequence has been spoken of without my voice present." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "That silence ends today." Murmurs stirred, quickly stilled by his raised hand. He spoke then of responsibility, of truth long deferred. Each sentence was measured, deliberate, cutting through speculation with steady resolve. When he acknowledged the child, heads turned as one. Margaret stood bravely when Clara nodded, her small figure suddenly central. The Duke descended the steps and knelt before her, his movement unhurried, intentional. Gasps rippled through the room. He addressed her not as an emblem or inconvenience, but as a person. "You spoke honestly," he said gently. "And honesty deserves answer." He rose and faced the assembly. "She is my daughter." The declaration struck with quiet force, more devastating for its calm. Lady Eleanor's breath caught, her composure finally cracking as color flared high on her cheeks. She rose, voice tight with disbelief. "You would abandon duty," she said, "for a tale untested?" Her words trembled between outrage and hurt. The Duke met her gaze steadily. "I abandon nothing," he replied. "I claim what is mine to claim." He turned then to Clara, extending his hand, not in command but invitation. The room watched, breath held, as she crossed to him. Her spine was straight, her eyes clear. He spoke her name with care, acknowledging her publicly for the first time. He spoke of her restraint, her courage, her refusal to barter truth for comfort. In doing so, he unraveled the narrative that had painted her as transgressor. Some faces softened, others hardened further. To Lady Eleanor, he offered respect, apology, and release. The engagement, he declared, would not proceed. There was no anger in his tone, only finality. She listened in silence, pride wounded but intact enough to accept the ending with dignity. When she left the hall, the space she vacated seemed charged with consequence. The Duke did not follow. He remained, anchored by choice rather than obligation. He addressed the room once more, his voice carrying an unexpected warmth. "Rank confers privilege," he said, "but it does not absolve neglect." He spoke of legacy not as lineage alone, but as the courage to correct one's course. The words unsettled some, inspired others. Scandal still hovered, but it had been named and faced, its power diminished by candor. Later, when the hall had emptied, the three of them stood together beneath the fading light. Margaret leaned against him now without hesitation, her trust intact. Clara watched, emotion pressing close to the surface she had long guarded. The Duke turned to her, the grandeur of his title momentarily stripped away. "I cannot undo what you endured," he said quietly. "But I will not ask you to endure alone again." She searched his face for pretense and found none. The future remained uncertain, its cost not yet fully revealed, but something irrevocable had shifted. As the evening bells began to toll beyond the windows, Clara realized that the world they faced would be harsher before it grew kinder, and that this declaration, brave as it was, had only begun to test the strength of their resolve. The days that followed were not gentle. London did not forgive quickly, nor did it forget. Doors closed with polite finality, invitations evaporated, and names once spoken with deference were now paired with hesitation. The Duke felt the shift keenly, yet he did not waver. He moved through the world with a quieter authority, one earned rather than assumed. Beside him, Clara learned that courage could be a daily practice, measured in small choices, steadfast silences, and the refusal to shrink when scrutinized. Margaret, oblivious to most of it, bloomed under recognition, her laughter a counterpoint to whispers that still trailed their steps. They left the city soon after, choosing distance not as escape but as breathing space where healing might begin without an audience. The country estate was older, rougher around the edges, its stones weathered by truth rather than performance. Here, titles mattered less than conduct, and the land answered only to care. The Duke walked its fields with his daughter, learning her questions, her habits, the quick curve of her smile. Each step stitched something new into him, a patience long unused. Clara watched from a distance, allowing them space to become, yet finding herself slowly claimed by belonging. She no longer lowered her eyes out of habit, only thoughtfulness, and when she spoke, she was heard. The house adjusted around them, rooms warming with routine, corners softened by presence, the future tentatively invited inside without ceremony or fear. Morning light found them unhidden, unashamed, and unchanging. Yet redemption is never granted without cost. Letters arrived bearing cool regret, withdrawn support, and carefully phrased warnings. The Duke read them without anger, placing each aside as one might set down a tool no longer useful. He learned to labor without applause, to speak plainly where once he had circled. Clara felt the weight of being chosen, not as a gesture but as a daily commitment. She answered it with steadiness, with work that knit household and heart together. At times, doubt returned, quiet and persistent, but it found less purchase now, eroded by consistency, by the simple fact of being met each morning with respect, and by a child's laughter ringing freely through unlocked doors that once guarded shame alone. It mattered deeply. The season turned, bringing a public moment the Duke could not avoid. A ceremony in the nearest town required his attendance, and with it the return of watchful eyes. They went together, unhidden. When whispers rose, he did not counter them, only stood with his family, hand resting openly on Margaret's shoulder. Clara felt the old tightening fear, then felt at ease. Some faces softened, others turned away, but the choice held. Later, as they walked home, bells carried across the fields, neither celebratory nor condemning, simply marking time. The Duke understood then that legacy was not secured by approval, but by the lives one stood beside when approval failed. Clara met his glance, a silent accord passing between them, stronger for having been tested. That night, by the fire, he spoke of marriage without ceremony, asking not for redemption but partnership. Clara answered with care, naming the risks that remained, the judgments still waiting. He listened, and in listening proved his intent. Their agreement was quiet, rooted in mutual willingness rather than need. Margaret, half asleep, watched them with solemn approval, as though guarding the threshold of something earned. When the house settled, Clara stood alone at the window, realizing that love had found her not in defiance of truth, but because of it. She felt no triumph, only a steadier ground beneath her feet, and the rare permission to rest without watching for collapse. Outside, stars emerged, unimpressed by rank, witnessing only constancy kept. Until morning returned again. Years later, the story would be told in simpler terms, stripped of its edges. A duke had chosen love. A woman had been vindicated. A child had been claimed. But within the walls they inhabited, the truth remained more complex, stitched from daily acts of attention. The Duke learned to be present, to apologize when wrong, to teach his daughter that worth was not granted by permission. Clara found her voice expand, no longer confined to careful rooms. She spoke for others when she could, remembering what silence had cost. Their home became known not for splendor, but for fairness, a place where people were met as they were, and allowed to remain. Such reputations travel slowly, yet they endure when others fail entirely. Quietly, on an autumn morning, mist gathered low over the fields. The three of them walked together, unhurried, leaving footprints that quickly softened. Margaret ran ahead, calling back stories she invented as she went. The Duke watched her, then turned to Clara. There were still challenges, he said, still voices that would question. She nodded, accepting the truth without fear. They had learned what endured. As bells began to ring from a distant tower, neither hurried their steps. Time, once their enemy, now felt like a companion, marking not what had been lost, but what had been chosen, again and again, with open eyes. The past no longer chased them, it walked behind, transformed into foundation rather than threat. Their future remained unfinished, alive, and honest. History would remember titles, dates, alliances. It would forget the small moments that truly shape a life. Yet within that forgetting, something persisted. A man had stood when silence was easier. A woman had refused to be erased. A child had spoken truth without knowing its price. Together, they had remade a legacy, not by denying the world's cruelty, but by meeting it with steadfast love. As the mist lifted and light found the path ahead, their figures moved forward, unremarkable to any passing eye. Only the land knew what had been won, and only time would tell how far such quiet courage might carry them beyond the reach of judgment, into a future still unwritten, still calling, and entirely their own at last. Together.